Where were you when you heard the exit poll for last month's election?
I was at home watching the election.
And what was your reaction? Did you shed a little tear like Theresa May?
No, not at all, because I actually think the result was extremely important for the country in the sense that it destroyed the mandate for a hard Brexit, and that's reopened the Brexit debate. Now we've, in my view, got to bring that to its full point of saying, let's not do this. Let's instead find a compromise with Europe and stay. But the election result for sure had the very positive effect of meaning that the Tories couldn't claim the mandate they wanted to claim.
But just take me back to that moment. How surprised were you? What was your immediate reaction?
You know, I was surprised. Though obviously it'd been, seen certain indicators in those last days, and I have been closely in touch with MPs who were fighting in the front line. And one of the things that I've said to people is, I'm very happy to be not just generous with what Jeremy Corbyn has achieved, but accept that the achievement was really significant. I mean, he generated a lot of enthusiasm amongst young voters. I thought he showed really excellent temperament during the course of the campaign, and I pay tribute to all of that. It's just that I have two very, very basic qualifications, which are pretty fundamental. Number one, I think this election was fought in very special circumstances, and I'm not sure the coalition that gave him that support will hold, especially if it appears that actually the Labour Party's position on Brexit is not much different from the Tories. And secondly, I haven't changed my view about the policy platform. It isn't a policy platform for the future. It's basically one of the past.
But you've written in this essay over the weekend that you didn't foresee the result. You said, I think, more or less all the elections since '79 ended the way you expected them to, not this one. What was it about this one that, why do you think you missed Jeremy's appeal? Why did so many of the rest of us miss Jeremy's appeal?
I think we missed it partly because there's a whole, you've got to understand today that there's a whole debate going on social media, in different forms of people interacting with each other, particularly young people, that really doesn't hit the mainstream media at all. So that's a lesson learned, and I think that's a very core lesson for the future.
But that's just a generational problem that we are not seeing into that whole political world.
Yes, I mean, I think there are lots of issues about that world, by the way, in social media and the trading of facts and information, which is a whole other question. But no, I think so. I think first of all there is frankly a generational problem in that. I mean, my children don't read newspapers in the same way. They don't get their news in the same way. They don't communicate in the same way that my generation did. So that's one big change. But the other change I think is really important for us to understand is the Tories fought a campaign that was not just disastrous, but they created in part for us a coalition. Because if you were against austerity and didn't want to see the Tories have a mandate for doing whatever Tory things they wanted to do, you had to come out and vote Labour. And secondly, if you wanted to stop a hard Brexit or a no-deal Brexit, you had to come out and vote Labour to do that. So I'm not saying Jeremy Corbyn didn't generate real enthusiasm, particularly amongst a group of young people. He definitely did. But I think there were other people that voted with enormous hesitation, not thinking they were making him Prime Minister, but thinking they were voting against the Tories. And therefore, I think when we look at the next election, we should be careful of our own hubris.
How do you know that? Because you wrote that on the weekend. You said you doubted that people were, or you doubted that everyone was voting for him to be Prime Minister, for his platform, that a lot of people you suspected thought the Tories would win. They were voting to neuter his mandate, I think was the way you put it. How do you know that?
Well, I think you know from two sources. First of all, I can just tell you anecdotally, I know masses of people in that situation who voted not because they believed Jeremy Corbyn was great, but they were determined to vote against the Tories. Secondly, there were candidates standing in the election, some of whom won very large majorities, by the way, explicitly on a programme of distance from the Labour leadership. Now, that's why I say to you, I think the sensible thing is not to say all those Labour voters voted with enthusiasm, or for someone like me to say, no, people weren't really enthusiastic about them. The essential thing is to understand this was a coalition of different types of people. Some were very enthusiastic, some were a lot more hesitant, and some, frankly, were Tories who really disliked the Tory campaign. But I don't think, I mean, look, I could be wrong, but I think there were significant numbers of people who will have voted Labour not in the expectation we were going to be the government. Now, next election, and this is why Labour's got to be careful of how we read this result. A, the Tories are never going to fight a campaign like that one. I know the Tories, they're not going to do that. And they're going to have a new leader as well. Secondly, our programme, particularly on tax and spending, is going to come under a lot more scrutiny than it did last time round. And the Tories decided in the last election to go after his patriotism, which was, in my view, another strategic mistake. Next time, they're going to go back and they're going to look at the tax and spending implications. And, you know, that's why I say the sensible thing for the Labour leadership, in my view today, would be to do a real analysis of what that Labour support was. I would like to see us shift to a much stronger leadership position against Brexit, and to make sure that the programme of change that we're advocating is credible and not just change-making.
You've obviously reflected quite a lot over the last month on the election result. Was there anything about it which made you question what you thought you knew about politics?
Yes, in the sense that, and not just this election result, but Brexit, the Trump victory in the US, you know, what's happening all over Europe.
Did you see any of the other two coming, by the way?
No.
So you've had three surprises.
Yeah,
I feel
exactly.
a little better
and you know,
about myself.
And you know, unless you're just completely you know, willing to reflect, then you should reflect. Here's what I think. I think that there is a real desire for change, a real sense of inequality and insecurity, and we have to deal with that. I still believe that if the centre puts forward strong radical solutions, but which are based on what I would call, you know, solutions that align with the future, I still think that position beats everything else.
Donald Trump didn't come out of the centre, did he?
Donald Trump didn't come out of the centre. The Democrats, in my view, were not quite in the centre themselves, but Macron was in the centre. So you've got to look at different, what do these results show you? I think they show you for sure people want change, right? If you're the status quo candidate, you're going to lose. But I don't think they conclusively show you that the populism of left or right is the only thing they'll vote for. I think they would vote for a radical change-making centre. But you know, that may be wrong.
Based on what, because the three results we just talked about, where in each case it was the populist, the opposite of the centrist candidate who won. Or
yeah,
the
but you've got to have four, haven't you? Because there have been four surprising results. Tell me how many people a year ago would have said the French election was going to give you President Macron.
Okay, so you're 1 for 4.
Right, I'm just saying, you can't put all of these things in the mix. I mean, what will come out of the German election is probably also the centre. Right. The poll that my institute's just done in France, Germany and the UK shows very strong support for the centre still, but it wasn't on offer in our election. And by the way, you know, it's a non-trivial point. Neither party actually won a majority. In the end, neither party was able to close the deal with the people. So
although Jeremy Corbyn got a bigger share of the vote than you did in your last election, roughly the same as your second election, more than Cameron in his first election.
Yeah, but you know, if you take it on that basis, and obviously if you're Theresa May, you want to, you know, she was a more successful politician than Margaret Thatcher. But so
he closed a 20-point poll lead.
No, that, and I don't take that away from him. You know, I said to you right at the very beginning, and I say all the way through, I agree, he did exceptionally well, and you've got to give him credit for that. It doesn't mean that the policies are correct, and it doesn't mean that the way that vote happened is necessarily replicable in the way I think that some of his people believe that it is. I think there's a lot of different elements that came together, and I think if we were sensible now, look, in any event, it's what I believe. You know, I mean, ultimately, the thing about politics is you know, and this is what's obviously changed. For most of my political life, I've been saying, I think this is the right way to go, and what's more, it's the only way to win an election. I have to qualify that now. I have to say, no, I think it's possible you end up with Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister.
So you accept that he could possibly win on the platform
I think
he's
you
on?
can't rule anything out in today's politics. But it doesn't stop me believing that if we deliver Brexit and at the same time are delivering the programme that he has at the moment, unreconstructed, unchanged, we will be in for a very, very difficult time as a country. Now, if people want to vote for it, because they voted for Brexit, and I didn't agree with that, so if people want to vote for it, they can vote for it. But, you know, when it comes to what you believe in, I think at the moment this country is essentially being offered two competing views of the 1960s, and there's no articulation of an agenda that really understands the future and the massive change, particularly through technology, artificial intelligence, automation, big data that's coming down the pipeline at us, and we are nowhere in dealing with this.
So the interesting thing, I think, is that you differentiate between what it takes to get to power and whether policies will work once you get to power. And where you have moved, it seems, is that you've always said, at least as far as I can remember, the only way to victory is through the centre, and you don't think that anymore.
Well, what I say is this: I still believe the surest route is through the centre,
but not the only way.
But I think you can't say in today's politics, particularly if you've gone through three things: the election of Donald Trump, Brexit, Jeremy Corbyn doing so well, and if you're in my position, you haven't got those things right, you've got to accept it's possible that that programme wins. I'm still doubtful about it. I'll be honest with you, I'm doubtful about it, because I do think that our vote was made up of many different component elements. But even if we win, you know, you've got to ask some really searching questions about the credibility of the programme. And I mean, I would even ask questions about whether it's a truly progressive programme, because what I'm seeing in the world today are challenges that we're not really addressing as a Labour Party, never mind the Tories.
Someone said to me that the experience of living through the last 3 or 4 elections, referendums, was a bit like believing the world was governed by Newtonian physics and then discovering there's this whole other world of quantum theory. There's a whole other parallel set of laws that apply. Is that a reasonable analogy? Does that echo with you, chime with you?
If I had a better understanding of physics, it probably would. It sounds, if what that means is that we're dealing with a new dimension and phenomenon in politics, we for sure are. Social media, by the way, I think is a massive part of that. The fragmentation and polarization of conventional media is a massive part of it. But so is a profound sense that globalization is creating losers culturally and economically, and the governing elements of our society aren't responding to that. And that's why I say it's absolutely essential, if you want to win in modern politics, you've got to offer people a way forward that is change. It's just that in my view it's going to be a change that is answering the call of the future and not looking back.
But essentially your prescription is the same as it always was. It's change through the centre. Some people would look at you and say, you've accepted that you didn't see a few things coming. You've made the most minimal, very male admission of fault, as it were, but really you haven't conceded anything. You haven't really changed your view of politics at all. You haven't allowed for the fact that any of the rules you think apply may no longer apply. Some people might think that's actually quite a Tony Blair way of responding to the challenge.
It depends what's changed and what's not changed. I mean, the policies that I would be implementing in government today would be completely different from the past. I think you've got to look at the whole way, for example, that modern capitalism works, and you've got to be analysing, does it work in the right long-term way for the future of the country? I think there's massive redesign of the strategy for producing additional productivity, skills, education. You know, I would have a completely new and different radical agenda, but no, I haven't changed my basic view, and why should I? That because it's what I believe. That the best.
But that's the really interesting thing, is because it hasn't actually, the events of the last 2 years haven't challenged any of your beliefs. I mean, I find myself looking at some of these things thinking, gosh, I just don't know. I don't know what I thought I knew about politics. Right, but you don't. You come out thinking my beliefs still stand.
You've got to distinguish between two separate things. One is accepting that there's something going on in politics that you didn't get and don't fully understand. We're completely on the same line with that. I agree. That's why I'm studying it very hard. The other thing is to work out what you believe in. Look, does the fact that the British people voted for Brexit mean that I think Brexit's right? No, I think it's a disastrous mistake for the country. I think it's relegating us, diminishing us is going to do us damage economically, going to do us damage politically. So if what you're saying to me, well, you should change your mind because the British people have now voted for it, I mean, that's essentially what Theresa May's saying. I'm afraid I don't agree with that.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about essentially what the kind of route to electoral success is. I don't think you've really changed your view of what it takes to get the Labour Party back to power.
I personally think it's a surer route to power to fight it from the centre, but I'm being open with you in saying that I accept now what, if you'd asked me a year ago, I would have dismissed as impossible. I accept as possible. You have to say in today's world now, there's been so many political upsets, it's possible that Jeremy Corbyn could become Prime Minister and Labour could win on that programme. So in that sense, I am changing my position. I'm just not changing my position as to the wisdom, especially at the same time as you're delivering Brexit, of delivering what is, frankly, an unreconstructed far-left programme. I mean, the country would not be in good shape if we did those two things at once.
Do you think the election result was, to any degree, a reaction to you? I mean, one hears of young people particularly who say, I went out because for the first time that I could remember there was a clear left proposition instead of a sort of Blairite sludge.
Yeah, but you know, people say these things. I mean, first of all, I mean, we didn't win. I think it's a non-trivial point. Now, I understand we did far better than everyone expected, but we weren't able to command a majority. And yes, a lot of young people were mobilised. I think Brexit was a very big factor. Tuition fees probably also a factor. The enthusiasm Jeremy Corbyn generated also a factor. But you know, we won 3 elections. You know, so
only one of them with a higher percentage of the vote.
Yeah, but that was because there was at that point an active third party. But by the way, there was never any doubt that we were going to win each one of those elections. Really, I mean, when you look back on it, it was very clear. Right? We haven't won an election yet. I mean, we've actually suffered our 3rd defeat. Okay, so I'm not taking away from Jeremy Corbyn and his people that we underestimated his appeal and the appeal of his programme. But I think they've also got to be careful, just as we shouldn't understate it, they shouldn't overstate it. And I think if you did an analysis in some of these constituencies, and I've talked to lots of MPs since the election, people voted Labour for all sorts of different reasons. They weren't all 100%, you know, chanting Jeremy Corbyn. I mean,
although the polls now suggest that, you know, it's not the case that the election happened, people registered their protest, and then they all fell away. He's leading in the polls.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But
that doesn't seem to quite chime with your view of why.
Well, I think it's worth doing analysis of this, but I still think you will find that the vote fragmented into a number of different buckets, some of which were very enthusiastic, some of which were less.
Just reflecting on the changes that you talked about in politics, you talked about social media, you talked about some of the sort of appetite for change, anger. Do you think there's been an actual sort of structural forever change that we haven't quite yet got our heads around, or do you think it's a period of sort of freakish weather and we'll come through the other side and the normal rules will apply again?
I think it's a really difficult question, and I'm not sure what the answer is. So what I'm saying is sort of work in progress in terms of my thinking, but I think 2 things are very different and 1 thing is the same. The 2 things that are very different are, first of all, I think social media, its interaction with a polarized, fragmented, divisive, partisan, conventional media is creating a very, very divided politics in which populism of left and right can gain a foothold very easily. That's one change. Secondly, I think post the financial crisis, there is a real feeling by people that globalization just is this force that rolls on and that many people feel powerless and left behind. And that has got to be addressed. So those 2 things have changed. What, in my view, has not changed is that the only things that will actually work, I mean, whether people vote for them or not, by the way, is another matter. Okay, but the only things that will actually work is a modern policy agenda that will be from a centre ground position. That is all that's going to win for the country. I'm not saying you can't have an election that ends up with a populism victory of right or left, but it's not necessarily what's right for the country.
But if you identify that first thing you talked about, which I think is absolutely right, that social media plays to the populists, it both polarizes and it allows them to mobilize. But it's a change that's not going away, right? It's happened. So isn't the logical, what follows from that logically is that actually the populists, the edges of the political spectrum, are in the ascendancy. There's no reason to think the moderate centre is going to come back, because that's a structural change that favours the ends of the spectrum.
There's certainly a structural media change, social and conventional media. I think it's an open question. I mean, I don't think you can say that the public is now going to vote for populism of the left and right and it isn't interested in the centre anymore. I mean, you have the Macron victory in France, which is important, but you also have, as our poll shows, the one we've done for our institute. In France, Germany and the UK, we polled all three countries. There's still a large majority of people who identify with the centre or with centre-left or centre-right. You know, I think it's very important about the British election that there wasn't a clear winner in the end. You know, now that, okay, you've got to delve into all the reasons for that, but no one had a sufficiently strong offer that actually brought a victory, you know, so a majority. So I think it's not clear, and I think we should be very wary of simply accepting that we're now in a new world where the populism of left and right is all that's people are going to vote for. I still think most people understand instinctively, even though they don't get a lot of it on the social media or conventional media, that the problems of the future aren't going to be solved by either a kind of anti-business tax and spend agenda of the left or an anti-immigrant agenda of the right.
What worries you more, Prime Minister May or Prime Minister Corbyn?
What worries me most actually is Brexit. I mean, I think every day it is clear the damage it's doing. Every day it's clear that if we had proper leadership in this country, we would be steering ourselves off this course and finding a compromise with Europe. And therefore I worry about Theresa May's programme, because she's going to deliver Brexit at any cost. I haven't changed my view about the wisdom of the Jeremy Corbyn economic programme. I think it's essentially a big tax and spend, sort of nationalisation, old left programme, and I think doing that at the same time as doing Brexit, and that is his position as well to do Brexit, yeah, I think it's going to be a big problem.
But I mean, it's a real
so don't ask
potential
me to choose,
choice. Which worries you more?
Brexit worries me most, and what worries me is that both political leaderships are in favour of it. So I don't want to get into a sort of, you know, quantitative assessment of which is more damaging. Brexit is damaging. A hard left economic programme is not good for the country. It's not going to allow us to succeed as a country. And I think both are massive distractions from a proper policy agenda that would start with the huge change that's happening in the world, and I need to respond to it as a country. And you know, we're not responding to it. We're literally, as other countries in the fast lane of progress, we're in the hard shoulder of nostalgia. I mean, it's not a sensible thing for the country.
Do you ever worry at all, perhaps when you look at some of these election results, where each time the British public is told something, they do the opposite? Do you ever wonder whether actually we might be in this sort of cycle where it's a bit like parents telling their kids to do something and they do the opposite, where you saying all this stuff is actually going to have the opposite effect?
Yeah, I mean, what worries me sometimes about, you know, is there any point in speaking? Both because of my own position and because of all the you know, because of this, you know, very harsh view of people who've been politicians in power. But I think if you really think your country is heading in the wrong direction, you've got a responsibility to say so. And as I keep saying to people, you know, if I was being elbowed out of the way in the stampede to say these things, then I probably wouldn't speak. But I mean, look, I could be completely wrong about this, and I'm perfectly happy to accept I may be. But I honestly do think the political choice in this country at the moment is grim for the country. I think Brexit is a terrible, terrible thing for the country to do to itself. It's the most extraordinary act of self-harm any modern developed country has done. And yet we appear to have a consensus that we've just got to do it because of the referendum, when in my view it's perfectly possible with the right leadership that the will of the country evolves as it sees the damage of Brexit and as it sees the possibility of an alternative, which we could have. We could reach a deal with Europe that has compromise on both sides. So yes, of course I worry that people just, you know, if I'm speaking, someone like me speaking, people just dismiss it, but what do you do?
You may be driving those last few votes into the Corbyn column, so he gets over the line.
You know, maybe so, but I mean, it just depends how strongly you feel. And I feel very strongly that this country is a great country, but it's playing with its own future in a really, really dangerous way. And, you know, if the country wants to go down that path, that's fine. But those of us who disagree in a very profound way with going down that path, I mean, I think we've got a responsibility at least to say it. And if people want to ignore it, that's their choice. But, you know, it's a free country and I'm free to speak and people are free to listen.
Tony Blair, thank you.
Thank you.